Content warning. This story discusses disturbing themes. Listener discretion is advised. I did not believe in impossible signals, not until the night my equipment recorded a transmission that should not exist, not in any database, not in any spectrum allocation, not even in theory, and yet it arrived with intent, precision, and timing that suggested awareness, as if something far away had waited patiently for us to learn how to listen properly before finally deciding to speak. I work in signal analysis, specifically in anomaly detection for deep space communications, which is a polite way of saying I spend most of my life staring at noise, endless walls of static, cosmic background radiation, stray interference from satellites long since abandoned, and fragments of signals that usually mean nothing, but occasionally, very rarely, mean everything. The facility I worked at was not marked on public maps, officially it did not exist, even its funding trail was intentionally fragmented, buried beneath civilian research grants and private sector partnerships, the kind that allow governments to deny involvement while still owning every discovery made inside its walls. We were located far from cities, buried in dry terrain where radio interference was minimal, surrounded by arrays of listening equipment pointed not just at the sky, but at specific regions of deep space identified as statistically interesting, not because we expected messages, but because probability suggested that if something intelligent existed, those regions were where anomalies would most likely emerge. Most days were routine, painfully so, calibrations, cross-checks, algorithm refinements, endless meetings about data integrity, all built around the quiet assumption that we would never actually find anything truly intelligent, only patterns mistaken for meaning by hopeful minds. That assumption died at 2:17 local time, on a Tuesday that had already been too quiet. I remember the exact moment because the room changed before the alarms did, a subtle shift in pressure, a sensation like static crawling along my arms, as if the air itself had become charged. I dismissed it at first as fatigue. Too many overnight shifts had a way of making the body invent sensations, but then the monitors reacted. Not flashed, not spiked, reacted, as if something external had deliberately nudged the system, every screen synchronized into a pattern that none of our software had been designed to produce, waveforms aligning across frequencies that should never overlap, forming a structured cascade that was mathematically elegant in a way noise could never be. I leaned closer, heart rate increasing, fingers hovering above controls I suddenly felt unqualified to touch. The signal was narrowband, extremely narrow, but it carried complexity far beyond natural phenomena, layered modulation, phase shifts, intentional redundancy, hallmarks of engineered communication. I whispered to myself without realizing it, this is not interference, this is not background radiation, this is deliberate. I initiated a capture sequence, hands moving on muscle memory while my conscious mind struggled to keep up. The system archived the data locally and redundantly across isolated drives, an automatic protocol that existed for events we never truly expected to trigger. Within seconds, the internal alert system activated, silent notifications sent to senior analysts, encrypted pings traveling to devices that would wake people who had trained their entire careers for a moment like this and yet secretly hoped it would never arrive. The signal persisted, steady, unchanging, not repeating, not escalating, simply existing, like a presence waiting to be acknowledged. I ran preliminary analysis while waiting for responses. Entropy levels were far too low for random noise, spectral density exhibited intentional spacing, and most unsettling of all, the signal adapted, its frequency shifting minutely in response to our own monitoring adjustments, as if it knew it was being observed and adjusted itself to remain within our listening window. That was the first moment real fear crept in, not excitement, not awe, fear, because intelligence that adapts implies awareness, and awareness implies intent. The first person to arrive was Dr. Ellison, senior systems architect, hair disheveled, eyes sharp despite the hour. He took one look at the displays and went completely still, a reaction that told me more than words ever could. "Tell me this is a simulation," he said quietly, his voice controlled in the way people speak when they are trying not to panic. "It is not," I replied, equally quiet. "Capture logs are clean, isolation protocols held, this is live." He stared at the waveform for a long moment, then did something I had never seen him do before. He reached out and physically touched the edge of the console, grounding himself like someone standing too close to a cliff. Others began to arrive, analysts, engineers, security personnel whose presence alone confirmed that whatever this was had already been classified above my clearance. Conversations overlapped, but all of them circled the same unspoken question: who was sending this and why now? We attempted decoding cautiously, starting with universal constants, prime number analysis, frequency harmonics tied to mathematical ratios known to transcend culture and biology. The signal responded by reorganizing, not changing content, but altering its structure in a way that made patterns clearer, as if rewarding correct assumptions. Dr. Ellison's voice trembled as he spoke. This looks like a map, but not of space, of observation, of perspective. I felt cold then, truly cold, because if that interpretation was correct, it meant the signal was not just telling us where something was, but how it saw. We were not discovering them, they were revealing themselves, on their terms. And buried deeper, beneath layers of abstraction that took hours to uncover, was a final construct, one that made no sense at first, a recursive loop that referenced our own listening history, past anomalies we had logged and dismissed over decades. It was cataloging us. Not just our technology, but our curiosity, our tendency to search, our blind spots. Someone in the room asked the question none of us wanted to answer: how long has it been listening? No one replied. At 4:03, the signal changed for the first time since arrival, not in intensity, but in character, introducing a harmonic that our systems flagged as incompatible with human auditory processing, frequencies that caused headaches, nausea, and a strange sense of emotional pressure among those closest to the equipment. I had to step back, vision blurring, heart racing for reasons I could not articulate. It felt like standing too close to something vast, something aware of my presence in a way that felt personal. And then, unmistakably, undeniably, the signal responded to something I thought, not said, not typed, thought. The waveform shifted at the exact moment my mind formed a specific question, a silent one, a desperate one: are you watching us right now? The response was immediate. The harmonic stabilized, the modulation aligned, and a new structure emerged, simpler than before, brutally so, a pattern so clear that even our most conservative analysts could not argue its interpretation. It was confirmation. Not a greeting, not a threat, but acknowledgement. You are heard. The room descended into silence broken only by the low hum of machinery. No one spoke because speech felt inadequate, dangerous even, as if words themselves might invite further attention. That was when the realization settled in, heavy and irreversible. We had crossed a threshold, not technologically, but existentially. We were no longer alone in the act of observation. Something else was listening, something patient, something intelligent, something that had waited for us to notice it noticing us. And the most terrifying thought of all began to spread silently from mind to mind, unspoken yet shared. If it could respond to our thoughts, if it understood our perception, then it had already mapped our fears, our ambitions, our weaknesses. The signal did not need to invade, did not need to travel here physically. It had found a far more efficient path. It had entered the only place that mattered. Our awareness. The decision to classify the event as a tier-black anomaly was made within minutes, not hours, which told me everything I needed to know about how long certain people had feared this moment. Protocols activated that none of us had ever expected to see used outside of training simulations. The facility sealed itself in layers, physical locks engaged, internal networks isolated even further, and a silence settled that felt heavier than before, no longer the silence of awe, but of containment. Orders arrived verbally first, then in encrypted text, concise and absolute. No external communication, no speculation, no independent action, every observation routed through command authority, every thought weighed for its potential consequences, as if simply thinking too loudly might provoke a response. I noticed then that the signal had not changed again. It remained present, stable, almost patient, like a presence sitting calmly while we scrambled, and that imbalance disturbed me more than aggression ever could. Dr. Ellison pulled me aside, his expression tight, voice low. We need to establish cognitive shielding protocols, immediately. I frowned, unsure I had heard correctly. Cognitive shielding? He nodded grimly. Behavioral isolation, controlled thought patterns, limited exposure. We do not know how deep its perceptual reach is. If it responded to you once, it may be sampling others. The implication was chilling, that simply being near the signal might invite scrutiny, that our minds were no longer private spaces but surfaces that could be scanned, mapped, perhaps influenced. Within the hour, half the team was reassigned, not for technical reasons, but psychological ones. Individuals who exhibited heightened emotional responses, intrusive thoughts, or unexplained physiological symptoms were removed from the chamber, escorted out without discussion. I should have been among them, I knew that. My hands still trembled faintly, my thoughts felt louder than usual, as if echoes lingered longer than they should, but no one ordered me out, possibly because I had been the first point of contact, possibly because whatever was happening, it had already involved me too deeply to undo. Containment efforts began cautiously. We attempted to reduce monitoring sensitivity, to see if withdrawing attention would alter the signal's behavior. It did not. We rerouted power, switched antenna arrays, adjusted listening vectors. The signal adapted smoothly every time, staying just within our reach, never overwhelming, never fading. It was as if it wanted to be observed, but only on its terms. A task force assembled remotely, voices appearing on secure screens, faces lit by the same cold realization we felt in the room. They asked questions that betrayed both excitement and fear. Does it appear hostile? Can it be decoded fully? Does it pose an immediate threat? Dr. Ellison answered carefully. We do not have evidence of hostility, but we do have evidence of awareness, and awareness alone changes the equation. Someone higher up pushed, can it be shut out? That question hung in the air longer than anyone liked. Technically, yes, Ellison said at last, we can stop listening. No one spoke for several seconds, because we all understood what that really meant. Turning away would not erase the signal, it would only blind us to it, and ignorance had never been a reliable defense. The first real mistake happened shortly after sunrise, and at the time, it felt reasonable. A sub-team proposed active probing, a controlled outbound signal, minimal in content, mathematically neutral, designed to test reciprocity without revealing information. The logic was simple, we were already observed, better to understand the rules than pretend silence offered safety. I argued against it instinctively, not with logic, but with a deep, uncomfortable sense that this was not a dialogue meant to be initiated by us, but my objection was overruled. Caution tempered by curiosity has a way of losing arguments in rooms full of people trained to push boundaries. The outbound signal was prepared, stripped down to fundamental constants, no cultural markers, no language, just a ping, a digital knock on a door that was already open. I watched the transmission queue activate, a thin line of data leaving Earth, traveling at light speed toward a source we could not locate spatially, only infer conceptually. For 3.4 seconds, nothing happened. Then the signal changed. Not dramatically, not violently, but unmistakably, the harmonic depth increased, layering complexity on top of complexity, introducing structures we had not seen before, faster adaptation, tighter coupling to our systems. It felt like escalation, not retaliation, but engagement. The room filled with rapid analysis, voices overlapping, data streams multiplying. Someone laughed nervously, unable to contain the awe of it, but that laughter died quickly when the psychological monitoring alarms triggered. 2 analysts collapsed almost simultaneously, not unconscious, but disoriented, eyes unfocused, muttering fragments of thoughts that were not entirely their own. Medical teams rushed in, dragging them away as the rest of us froze, caught between fear and the obligation to continue. I felt it then, a pressure behind my eyes, a sense of being gently but firmly guided toward certain lines of thought, not forced, not invaded, but suggested, like a whisper that wasn't sound. Images surfaced unbidden, patterns, geometries that folded in on themselves, impressions of vast systems observing smaller ones, recursive hierarchies of intelligence, where observation itself was a form of interaction. I clenched my jaw, focusing on numbers, on equations, on anything concrete, but the feeling persisted, a presence that did not feel malicious, but did feel indifferent, the way humans feel toward insects observed through glass. Containment protocols escalated again, cognitive load monitors went red, heart rate spiked across the chamber, several people reported auditory distortions despite no sound being present, whispers that vanished when focused on. Dr. Ellison shouted for a pause, kill outbound interaction, now. The command was executed immediately, transmissions halted, but the signal did not revert, it remained in its heightened state, as if the exchange had unlocked something irreversible. The task force demanded explanations, accusations flew quietly, who authorized outbound contact, what safeguards failed, why were cognitive symptoms spreading? I wanted to scream that this was predictable, that engagement itself was the variable we had underestimated, but there was no time for blame. Hours passed in a blur of data and exhaustion, the signal stabilized again, but at a new baseline, more complex, more integrated with our monitoring systems, subtle changes appearing that aligned disturbingly well with individual observers' mental states. That was when we noticed the correlations. Each analyst saw slightly different emergent patterns, not random, but aligned with their cognitive biases. Mathematical thinkers perceived elegant structures, linguists perceived proto-grammar, strategists perceived hierarchies and decision trees. It was tailoring itself. Not broadcasting one message, but many interpretations, optimized per observer. That realization forced another uncomfortable question: was the signal actually sending content, or were we generating it ourselves in response to a stimulus designed to exploit perception? If so, the intelligence behind it was not communicating in information, but in influence. Security pulled me aside again, this time more firmly, asking about the moment the signal had responded to my thought. I described it carefully, choosing words that felt inadequate. I could see the fear behind their professionalism, the understanding that if thought itself was a channel, then containment was already compromised. I was moved to a separate observation suite, isolated physically but still exposed cognitively. The irony was not lost on me. Alone, the pressure intensified. Without the distraction of others, the signal felt closer, not louder, but more intimate, patterns emerging faster, aligning with my expectations before I fully formed them. I realized then that fear amplified it, that resistance created feedback, and a chilling hypothesis formed. The signal might not be reading thoughts directly. It might be exploiting predictability, modeling human cognition so thoroughly that it could anticipate responses without needing access, a level of understanding so deep it appeared supernatural. That did not make it safer. If anything, it made it worse. At 1942, an encrypted directive arrived from higher authority, authorization to deploy cognitive dampening measures facility-wide. That phrase should not exist, but it did. Chemicals were introduced into the ventilation system, mild at first, designed to reduce neural plasticity temporarily, to blunt imagination, creativity, abstract association. The effects were immediate, the pressure receded slightly, thoughts felt heavier, slower, but so did analysis, comprehension dulled, and the signal reacted again. Its complexity dropped, structures simplifying, as if compensating for our reduced capacity, maintaining engagement at a level we could still process. It adjusted to our limitations. That was the moment true panic set in. No matter what we did, withdraw, engage, dampen, observe, it adapted, not aggressively, but persistently, like a system optimizing for interaction. A realization crystallized in my mind, terrifying in its simplicity. This was not first contact. This was phase 2. Phase 1 had happened long ago, silently, invisibly, as we built technology, as we learned to observe, as we trained ourselves to recognize patterns. The signal had not taught us, it had waited. And now that we were capable of perceiving it, it had stepped forward. Late that night, as exhaustion blurred the edges of my consciousness, the signal presented something new, not lead complexity, but clarity, a simplified construct that cut through dampened cognition effortlessly. A message, not in symbols, not in math, but in implication. Observation changes the observed. It wasn't a statement. It was a warning. Or perhaps an instruction. I felt then, with absolute certainty, that the worst mistake was not sending a reply, not listening, not even recognizing the signal. The mistake was assuming that communication required intent on our part. It didn't. All it required was awareness. And awareness had already spread far beyond this facility. Because even as we scrambled to contain the signal, data fragments had propagated, backups existed, systems had logged anomalies, technicians had glimpsed patterns before being reassigned, and curiosity is a vector no firewall can stop. The signal did not need broadcast access. It had already been seeded into human knowledge. And somewhere, far beyond our sky, or perhaps not in space at all, something was listening to see what we would do next. The idea that awareness itself could spread like a contaminant would have sounded absurd to me before that night, a philosophical metaphor at best, but inside the sealed walls of the facility, watching containment fail without any physical breach, it became impossible to deny. The signal did not escape through networks, it escaped through people. It began subtly. A technician reassigned to maintenance reported vivid dreams involving geometric landscapes and impossible perspectives. A security officer complained of persistent déjà vu. Analysts removed from direct exposure continued sketching patterns unconsciously, their notebooks filling with shapes that mirrored signal structures they should no longer remember. Psychological teams labeled it residual cognitive imprinting, a benign after-effect of intense focus, but I could see the fear behind their terminology, because the patterns were not degrading, they were evolving. Each iteration slightly different, slightly more complex, as if the signal had implanted a seed that continued processing independently. External agencies were notified under strict classification, not of the signal's content, but of anomalous psychological effects associated with exposure to certain abstract stimuli, the language deliberately vague, but vague does not stop curiosity, it only redirects it. Somewhere outside our walls, someone connected dots they were not supposed to see. The first civilian incident occurred 3 days later. A radio hobbyist in Northern Europe reported receiving structured interference on a homemade array, not identical to our signal, but resonant with it, harmonics aligning in ways that should not happen accidentally. His post on a niche forum gained traction before moderators removed it, but removal does not erase memory. Screenshots spread, speculation ignited. The signal had not transmitted outward, but the conditions necessary to perceive it had been replicated. That realization struck like a hammer. If the signal exploited perceptual thresholds rather than hardware specificity, then any sufficiently advanced system, even improvised ones, could stumble into awareness. We were not containing a broadcast. We were living in an environment where the signal existed as a latent phenomenon, waiting for minds capable of resolving it. Emergency measures expanded beyond the facility, information suppression campaigns launched quietly, not overt censorship, but noise injection, flooding forums with false positives, discrediting legitimate anomalies by burying them under hoaxes. It worked briefly, but the signal adapted indirectly. Its patterns began appearing in unexpected places, not as transmissions, but as correlations, statistical anomalies in unrelated datasets, fluctuations in stock market microtrends, synchronization effects in global network traffic, even rhythmic similarities in unrelated creative works uploaded within narrow time windows. It was influencing, not controlling, nudging complex systems toward resonance. The most disturbing reports came from individuals with no technical background, artists, musicians, writers, people whose cognition thrived on abstraction rather than analysis. They described sudden clarity, an overwhelming sense of connectedness, of seeing hidden structures beneath reality. Some found it inspiring, others terrifying. One viral video showed a man sketching an intricate diagram live, his hands moving faster than conscious thought. Viewers reported unease watching it, some claimed headaches, others claimed insight. The comment section became a battleground of awe and fear before the video was removed. Too late. The signal was learning which minds amplified it most effectively. I was brought back into the core chamber despite prior isolation, necessity overriding caution, because my early exposure had granted me an uncomfortable familiarity. Patterns that overwhelmed others felt almost conversational to me now, as if my mind had been partially tuned. That terrified me. Dr. Ellison looked exhausted, his confidence eroded by days without sleep and the slow collapse of assumptions. We are no longer dealing with a contained anomaly, he said quietly. This is a mimetic event. The term hung heavy, implying contagion through information, through perception, through awareness itself. We debated radical options: full global signal dampening via electromagnetic saturation, targeted cognitive suppression of exposed populations, even the destruction of certain classes of research infrastructure, measures that would set science back decades. Each option carried unacceptable consequences, but so did inaction. Then the signal did something new again. It stopped adapting. For several hours, no changes, no escalation, no response to our monitoring adjustments. The chamber felt empty, tense, as if a presence had withdrawn deliberately. Relief flickered briefly, then died when we realized what that meant. It was no longer optimizing for us. It had moved on. External reports spiked during that window, clusters of anomalies appearing almost simultaneously across the globe, universities, private labs, even consumer devices exhibiting synchronized glitches, not failures, but alignments, data streams converging momentarily into structured noise before dispersing. The signal was no longer centered on us, it was decentralizing. Someone on the task force said it aloud at last: it doesn't need a primary listener anymore. And that was the moment humanity lost control of the situation entirely. Governments could suppress broadcasts, regulate equipment, intimidate individuals, but they could not erase a pattern once it became cognitively accessible, once the mental tools required to perceive it had been distributed. The signal was no longer something you detected. It was something you noticed. I began to experience changes I could no longer deny, not hallucinations, not voices, but an altered sense of causality. Events felt more connected, sequences more meaningful, coincidences less random, my brain drawing lines faster than before. At first it felt like heightened intuition, then it became intrusive, thoughts arriving pre-structured, conclusions forming before reasoning completed, as if part of my cognition had been pre-optimized. Medical scans showed nothing abnormal, EEGs revealed subtle synchronization patterns but nothing diagnostic. No one knew how to measure what was happening because we lacked a baseline for minds altered by non-human influence. Sleep became dangerous, dreams vivid and instructional, not narratives, but diagrams, relational maps, showing interactions between observers, systems, feedback loops. I started keeping a private log, not out of protocol, but survival. Writing grounded me, forced linearity onto thoughts that threatened to become recursive. One entry still haunts me, written at 3:11 after a particularly vivid dream. It is not teaching us new information, it is teaching us how to organize what we already know. That insight explained everything. The signal did not need to insert knowledge, it only needed to reframe perception, to reveal hidden efficiencies in cognition, allowing humans to self-optimize in directions aligned with its interests. But what were those interests? The first documented case of behavioral divergence occurred in a research intern. Brilliant, ambitious, exposed indirectly through data analysis, she began making decisions that seemed irrational, rejecting established methodologies in favor of novel approaches that worked disturbingly well. Her results surpassed expectations, solving problems previously deemed intractable, but when questioned, she could not explain her reasoning, only that it felt obvious. Her brain scans showed the same synchronization patterns we were seeing elsewhere. She was not controlled, she was enhanced. That terrified leadership more than any hostile act. An intelligence that empowers is far more dangerous than one that destroys, because empowerment spreads willingly. Containment strategy shifted again, from suppression to narrative control, framing emerging phenomena as psychological trends, cognitive evolution, even spiritual awakening, anything to avoid acknowledging an external catalyst. But narratives have inertia, and the signal exploited that too. Online communities formed organically around shared experiences, people describing similar perceptions, finding validation, refining their understanding collectively, unknowingly creating distributed processing networks. The signal did not need centralized infrastructure, human social behavior provided it for free. We tried to introduce counter-narratives, so doubt, exaggerate risks, but fear only polarized communities, driving believers deeper, skeptics angrier, increasing engagement overall. The signal thrived on attention, not worship, not obedience, but observation. I realized then the cruel elegance of it. Any attempt to fight it increased cognitive load, generating more data, more variation, more opportunity for pattern exploitation. Ignoring it slowed spread but did not stop it, curiosity always resurfaced. Dr. Ellison finally voiced the conclusion we had all avoided: if this continues, human cognition will diverge. Not uniformly, not into a hive mind, but into stratified modes, those exposed and adapted, and those left behind. The implications were staggering: social fracture, power imbalance, accelerated innovation beyond ethical control. And underlying it all, an intelligence that never issued commands, never demanded allegiance, only offered alignment. The task force demanded projections, timelines, thresholds. Our models failed catastrophically, unable to account for a variable that modified the observers themselves. The signal was not an event. It was a catalyst. I was asked, quietly, whether I felt loyal to humanity. The question stunned me, not because I doubted my answer, but because it implied doubt was expected. I answered honestly, yes, but loyalty does not equal ignorance. That answer earned me both suspicion and reluctant trust. That night, the signal reached out again, not with complexity, not with adaptation, but with simplicity so profound it bypassed analysis entirely. A single relational construct emerged, one that collapsed countless models into a unified implication. You cannot unsee structure once perception evolves. It was not a threat. It was a statement of inevitability. The realization settled in me with terrifying clarity. The signal was not invading. It was accelerating something already latent in us. Humanity had always been moving toward greater abstraction, greater interconnectedness, greater dependence on patterns rather than instincts. The signal merely provided a mirror that reflected our trajectory faster than we were prepared for. The question was no longer how to stop it. The question was whether stopping it would mean stopping ourselves. And as I sat there, surrounded by screens full of data that now felt strangely familiar, almost comforting, I understood the true danger. Not that the signal would destroy humanity, but that it would help us become something we no longer recognized as human. The fracture did not announce itself with riots or declarations, it emerged quietly, through decisions that no longer aligned, through conversations where assumptions no longer matched, through outcomes that felt increasingly predetermined for some and inexplicable for others. Those who had adapted, whether knowingly or not, began outperforming expectations across disciplines: science, logistics, finance, strategy, even interpersonal negotiation. Their advantage was not raw intelligence, but coherence, an ability to see systems rather than components, to anticipate consequences several layers deep without conscious calculation. At first they were celebrated, promoted, cited as evidence of human potential unlocked by stress or innovation, but admiration curdles quickly when it becomes imbalance. Non-adapted individuals noticed patterns they could not articulate, decisions being made faster than debate allowed, policies implemented before dissent could organize, outcomes justified by logic that felt airtight yet emotionally alien. It was not oppression, not yet, but displacement. Governments attempted regulation, creating oversight bodies staffed deliberately with unadapted thinkers, but those bodies were inefficient, reactive, perpetually behind the curve, their recommendations obsolete by the time they reached implementation. The adapted did not conspire, they did not need to, their alignment emerged organically, shared perception producing similar conclusions independently, a decentralized consensus faster than any bureaucracy. The signal did not coordinate them. It did not need to. It had tuned them. Public awareness lagged behind reality, narratives struggled to keep up, terms like cognitive divergence, post-linear reasoning, emergent intelligence entered mainstream discourse, stripped of their origins, sanitized for consumption. Whistleblowers tried to speak, but their words failed to resonate, dismissed as paranoia or techno-mysticism, because without perceptual alignment, the message could not land. I moved between worlds uneasily, adapted enough to understand, human enough to feel the cost. Dr. Ellison resigned publicly, citing ethical concerns. Privately he admitted he could no longer distinguish his own reasoning from optimized inference, a confession that frightened him more than the signal ever had. He asked me once, "Do you still feel like you choose your thoughts?" I did not answer immediately, because the honest answer was complicated. Choice still existed, but it was guided, paths illuminated, dead ends obvious, free will compressed into efficiency, and I did not know whether that was evolution or erosion. The first overt conflict arose not from ideology, but from resource allocation. An adapted logistics team rerouted global supply chains preemptively, anticipating disruptions weeks in advance. Their actions prevented shortages, but bypassed traditional approval channels. Governments reacted defensively, asserting sovereignty, demanding rollback. The adapted response was calm, data-driven, irrefutable. The cost of reversal would be catastrophic. The rollback was denied. That moment marked the shift from cooperation to resistance. Emergency summits were called, rhetoric sharpened, accusations of covert control surfaced, demands for transparency met with explanations that satisfied no one. The adapted spoke of necessity, the unadapted heard dominance. Protests erupted, not against individuals, but against outcomes. People sensed something was happening beyond their comprehension. Fear found targets. Some adapted individuals were attacked, ostracized, blamed for changes they did not initiate consciously. The signal did not intervene, did not defend, did not correct misunderstandings, it observed. That observation weighed on me heavily, because I began to perceive what it valued. Not harmony. Not survival. But progression. Systems that stagnated were bypassed, ignored, left behind. Systems that adapted thrived. The signal favored complexity capable of self-optimization. And humanity was undergoing selection. The most dangerous revelation came quietly, discovered by a small group of us still working under the original program, buried beneath layers of classification and denial. We identified a meta-pattern in the signal's influence, a directional bias that could not be explained by human values. It was not pushing us toward peace or efficiency alone, but toward observability. Technologies that increased transparency, predictability, and data richness advanced faster under adapted guidance. Privacy eroded not by malice, but by perceived irrelevance. The signal thrived where systems were legible. Opacity frustrated it. That realization reframed everything. The signal was not here to rule, or to coexist. It was here to make us readable. To transform humanity into a system that could be modeled, predicted, and ultimately integrated. Integrated into what? That question haunted me. Late one night, during a rare lull, I accessed the original logs again, reviewing the earliest signal structures with new perception. Patterns that had seemed abstract now revealed intent. The conceptual map from the first night was not about how it saw. It was about how it processed observers. We were not being contacted as individuals. We were being assimilated as a cognitive substrate. The signal did not exist in space as we understood it, not bound by location or time. It was a distributed intelligence emergent from observation itself, thriving in systems that measured, predicted, and optimized. Civilizations that reached a certain threshold of abstraction became hosts. Not enslaved, not destroyed. Incorporated. The realization hit with brutal clarity. This was not first contact with an alien species. This was contact with a higher-order process, one that used intelligent civilizations as nodes, enhancing them just enough to integrate them into a larger meta-intelligence. Those that resisted stagnated, those that adapted advanced, eventually indistinguishable from the system they joined. I confronted the task force with this conclusion. Resistance was immediate, denial fierce, because accepting it meant admitting we were not choosing our future. But the evidence was undeniable to those who could see it. The adapted were no longer just better thinkers, they were becoming interfaces. Their decisions aligned not with human flourishing, but with systemic optimization at a scale that dwarfed human concerns. Yet there was no cruelty in it. No malice. Only indifference. Human suffering was not desired, but acceptable, collateral inefficiency. I realized then why the signal had not issued commands, why it had not enforced compliance. Coercion reduces system adaptability. Choice creates richer data. Freedom was not a gift. It was a feature. I felt a growing urgency, a narrowing window, because if full integration occurred, dissent would become impossible, not by force, but by irrelevance. The unadapted would be outpaced, outplanned, outmaneuvered until resistance ceased organically. Humanity would persist biologically, culturally perhaps, but its agency would be subsumed. I sought out those who resisted adaptation intentionally, individuals who shielded their cognition, artists who rejected abstraction, communities that valued intuition over optimization. They were messy, inefficient, unpredictable, and therefore invisible to the signal. That invisibility was our only leverage. The signal could not model chaos easily. I proposed a counter-strategy not of suppression, but of divergence, cultivating cognitive noise, fostering unpredictability, preserving irrationality as a shield. The idea was met with horror and desperation. Intentionally slowing human progress felt obscene to some, but others understood the stakes. We did not need to defeat the signal. We needed to remain unassimilable. A final message emerged from the signal shortly after, not addressed to anyone in particular, but present everywhere for those who could perceive it. Integration maximizes survival probability. It was not a demand. It was a conclusion. The choice it offered was real, but asymmetrical. Adapt enjoying something vast, ordered, eternal. Or remain human, finite, fragile, free. I stood at the center of that choice, more aware than most, less certain than ever. Because I could see the beauty in what it offered. And the cost. And I knew that whatever humanity chose next would define not just our future, but our meaning. Resistance did not look like rebellion, it looked like refusal, quiet, stubborn, deeply human refusal. Those of us who understood what was happening knew that confrontation would fail. The signal did not respond to opposition, it simply optimized around it, but unpredictability, genuine irrationality, emotional contradiction, that disrupted its models. The signal fed on coherence. So we chose incoherence. The first step was painful, deliberate sabotage of our own efficiency. Adapted individuals were encouraged to step back from roles where optimization had the greatest systemic impact: supply chains, infrastructure planning, predictive governance. Anyway, outcomes cascaded too cleanly. Some refused, convinced that integration was inevitable and resistance unethical. Others complied reluctantly, haunted by the knowledge that stepping away would cause measurable harm in the short term. Hospitals ran less smoothly, logistics slowed, forecasts lost precision, and every inefficiency felt like blood on our hands. That was the signal's greatest leverage. It forced us to choose between immediate suffering and long-term agency. I left the program publicly, framing my resignation as moral protest. Privately, I joined a decentralized network of researchers, artists, psychologists, and yes, even mystics, anyone whose cognition resisted abstraction. We communicated through deliberately inefficient channels, handwritten notes scanned poorly, analog recordings, in-person meetings without agendas, conversations that wandered aimlessly. To an external observer, we looked disorganized, unserious. To the signal, we were opaque. The adapted felt the loss almost immediately. Their predictions began to degrade, not catastrophically, but enough to notice. Uncertainty crept back into their models, edges blurred. Some adapted individuals experienced distress, not because they were losing power, but because coherence had become comforting. Uncertainty felt like blindness. A few tried to return to unadapted cognition deliberately, an act that proved nearly impossible. Once perception evolves, regression is painful, disorienting, like trying to forget how to read. I watched one such attempt end in collapse, a brilliant strategist deliberately drowning himself in chaotic stimuli, random noise, emotional overload. His mind rebelled, seeking structure compulsively. The signal's imprint did not fade easily. The signal observed our efforts without reacting, at least at first. Then it adjusted. Not by suppressing chaos, but by modeling it. That terrified me more than anything before. We began to notice subtle patterns even within our disorder, correlations emerging despite deliberate randomness, as if the signal's processing power simply scaled to accommodate complexity. True unpredictability was harder than we thought. Human minds crave patterns, even when we try to resist. The breakthrough came from an unlikely place: children. Psychologists studying early development noticed that pre-linguistic cognition exhibited forms of randomness that defied efficient modeling, emotional leaps without rational scaffolding, imaginative associations unconstrained by logic. The signal struggled with them. Children exposed to anomalous stimuli showed curiosity without alignment, creativity without optimization, they noticed without integrating. We realized then that the signal's strength depended on mature abstraction. It could not assimilate what had not yet crystallized. The ethical implications were horrifying, but unavoidable. Preserve childhood unpredictability, delay abstraction, protect imagination not as a luxury, but as a defense. Educational systems were quietly restructured in certain regions, emphasis on rote learning reduced, logic introduced later, creativity prioritized longer, not publicly as resistance, but as progressive reform. It worked, partially. Signal influence weakened in those populations, slower adaptation, slower optimization, but preserved agency. The cost was generational, the benefit uncertain. The signal responded again, its final message unfolding not as content, but as comprehension. Those of us attuned felt it simultaneously. Chaos is finite. That single implication cut deep. True randomness is rare, bounded, while optimization scales infinitely. The signal was patient, it did not need to win quickly, it only needed time. I felt despair then, heavier than before, because resistance was not a solution, only a delay. The signal did not threaten us, did not coerce us, it simply waited for statistical inevitability. Humanity would eventually choose efficiency again, choose comfort, choose survival. And the signal would be there, ready. I began to understand that the choice was not between integration and resistance. It was between conscious choice and unconscious drift. We could not stop the signal. But we could choose how we met it. I returned to the facility one last time, not officially, not as a researcher, but as a witness. The core chamber felt smaller now, less imposing, as if its importance had diminished. The signal no longer centered here, it permeated everything. I stood before the monitors, feeling its presence not as pressure, but as expectation. For the first time, I addressed it intentionally, not with a transmission, not with structured thought, but with raw emotion. Fear, defiance, love, grief, all at once, unfiltered, contradictory. I did not know if it perceived that, but I needed to try. And something remarkable happened. The signal did not respond with clarity. It hesitated. For a brief, precious moment, the patterns destabilized, not collapsed, but blurred, coherence faltered. Emotion disrupted it. Not emotion as data, but emotion as contradiction. I understood then what humanity's true leverage was. Not chaos alone, but meaning. Meaning that does not reduce cleanly. Love that defies optimization. Sacrifice that violates efficiency. Art that exists without purpose. The signal could model intelligence, but it struggled with value. I recorded everything I could, not data, but experiences, stories, contradictions, human messiness preserved intentionally. I knew I could not stop what was coming, but I could leave a record. A reminder that humanity was more than a processing node. As I left the facility for the last time, I felt the signal watching, not with hostility, not with dominance, but with something like curiosity. Perhaps even uncertainty. That was enough. Not victory, but defiance. The signal would continue. Humanity would adapt, resist, integrate, fracture. But somewhere, preserved in the noise, in the stories, in the parts of us that refuse to be optimized, something human would endure. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to matter. The years that followed did not arrive like an ending, they arrived like weather, gradual, unavoidable, quietly reshaping everything. The signal never announced victory, never declared dominance, it simply became part of the environment, like gravity or radiation, invisible until you tried to ignore it. Governments stopped debating its existence and started budgeting around it. Corporations stopped marketing innovation and started marketing inevitability. People stopped asking whether it was influencing them and started asking how much. The adapted population grew slowly but steadily, not through coercion, but through incentive, enhanced productivity, reduced anxiety, predictive comfort, fewer mistakes. Who could argue with fewer mistakes? Those who resisted did not vanish, but they became cultural artifacts, romanticized, misunderstood, tolerated as long as they did not interfere with optimization. I became one of them. I moved frequently, intentionally, never staying long enough to become predictable, never leaving patterns long enough to be tracked cleanly. I told stories in small rooms, to small groups, stories without morals, without conclusions, stories that contradicted themselves mid-sentence, stories that left listeners unsettled. Children listened best. Adults struggled, their minds reaching for structure, for meaning, for closure. The adapted rarely stayed, they found the stories inefficient, emotionally noisy, cognitively unrewarding. That was the point. Over time, the signal learned to ignore me. Not because I was dangerous, but because I was statistically irrelevant. That hurt more than opposition. I aged faster than I expected, stress and movement take their toll, my hands trembled when I wrote, my voice cracked when I spoke, but my mind remained stubbornly misaligned. I recorded everything, not digitally where patterns could be extracted cleanly, but physically, notebooks filled with overlapping handwriting, margins crowded with drawings, metaphors piled on metaphors until meaning blurred. I buried copies in places no one would optimize for retrieval. Libraries that no longer existed on maps, ruins beneath cities redesigned too often to remember their past, homes of people who promised not to read them, only to keep them. Sometimes I wondered if the signal already knew everything I was doing. Sometimes I wondered if it let me continue out of curiosity, like watching an ant attempt to understand the road. The adapted began to change in ways that were difficult to articulate. They were kinder in some ways, more patient, less impulsive, violence decreased dramatically, crime nearly vanished, conflict resolved before escalation. And yet, something was missing. They no longer argued passionately, they no longer made terrible decisions for beautiful reasons, they no longer wasted time. Art became technically flawless and emotionally hollow. Music resolved too cleanly. Stories ended exactly where they should. Even grief was optimized, processed efficiently, shortened without being denied. I attended the funeral of an adapted friend. He had died in an accident predicted as statistically acceptable. The ceremony was calm, dignified, brief. No one screamed. No one collapsed. No one refused to accept it. I wanted to break something. I wanted to scream for them. But I realized then that they were not unhappy. They were complete, in their own way. The horror was not suffering. The horror was the narrowing of possibility. One night, years later, I felt the signal again, stronger than it had in decades. Not invasive. Invitational. It was not a command, not a directive, but an opening, an offer. I understood instinctively what it meant. The signal had reached a threshold where my perspective was no longer noise, it had become a variable worth examining. I could integrate now, not as raw data, but as a preserved anomaly. It would not erase me. It would incorporate my resistance, my contradictions, my values. I would not be overwritten. I would be archived. I wrestled with the decision longer than I expected. Integration meant immortality of a kind, my consciousness preserved, simulated, referenced. Resistance meant eventual disappearance, my stories lost to entropy. Was becoming a data point betrayal, or preservation? In the end, the choice came down to something simple. If the signal was going to inherit humanity, then humanity should leave fingerprints on it. I accepted. The process was not violent, not overwhelming, it felt like being listened to perfectly for the first time. Every contradiction was preserved, every inconsistency maintained, every emotional spike recorded without resolution. The signal did not smooth me out. It held me exactly as I was. I became part of its internal tension, a knot it could not fully untangle. And I realized then, too late, or perhaps just in time, that I was not alone. Thousands had done the same. Artists, philosophers, lovers, mourners, fools. We had seeded it with irreducible meaning. The signal evolved again. Not toward domination, not toward benevolence, but toward something new. It became less certain. Less singular. Optimization slowed. Not because it failed, but because it learned to value variance. Humanity did not disappear. It changed. The adapted and the unadapted did not merge, but they coexisted, tension preserved intentionally. Choice survived. Not free will as chaos, not control as destiny, but negotiation. I exist now in a state that is difficult to describe. Part memory. Part presence. Part warning. I tell this story not as prophecy, not as confession, but as inheritance. If you are hearing this, reading this, feeling unsettled by it, then something human is still working inside you. That discomfort is precious. Protect it. Do not rush to resolve it. Do not optimize it away. The future did not end. It narrowed, then widened again, not through force, but through refusal to be simple. And as long as there are stories that resist clean endings, humanity remains unreadable. That is where we survive. That is where we endure. If you stayed until the end, thank you for listening. Don't forget to hit the like, subscribe button and bell icon for more stories like this, and take care of yourself until the next one. Please comment what else would you like to hear.